It's very hard to write in New York. Upstate is very quiet, and the iTelephone doesn't work, because American telephone and telegraph is very selective about where it beams its signals. Next year, if Verizon takes over the iPhone, maybe it'll work, but not now. So that's the place I go to escape from technology and from New York. The best parts of this book were written in Italy, in Umbria. There are many, Italy's an interesting place. There's many aristocrats there who have castles who give them to writers for a while. It's great. Bring your own counts. You know.
Speaking of places outside New York, in the book, what is going on in Troy or other parts of America?
In my mind, places like Troy are the places where all the violence happens. This is, in the world of this book, not to give away too much, and this is sort of, again, extrapolating from the most horrifying versions of what could ever happen. New York and several cities like San Francisco have become what are called trophy cities. These are cities that are global where, for example, in New York, so much of the population of Manhattan are just people who are millionaires or billionaires in India or Russia or Brazil or wherever, Venezuela, and they just have an apartment there, and this is sort of their little playground. In this book, New York and other very elite American cities become these playgrounds, and everything else just completely falls apart. To the point where in the end, the whole country is bought out by a Norwegian hedge fund for very cheap. The people like Troy and Utica, places that are very post-industrial, are used basically as little sort of, where the bipartisan party and it's the American Restoration Authority and the National Guard, which are deputized by it, take care of their enemies. But I like to leave the horror off stage. This is, to me, it's more horrifying if you just live within the minds of these and lives of these basically middle class or upper middle class people, and keep the real horror of what's happening just vaguely mentioned.
The extract that you read is very funny. And the writers that you mentioned this one, Chekhov and Tolstoy, are all very serious, right? Is there a very serious side to this book?
Is there a more serious side to this book? Yeah, things go really badly. And this is a good question to ask, is can comedy be serious? At what point can one say that, that the work transcends basic comedy? A good example is the writer Evelyn Waugh, the British writer of the 20th century, who wrote many very funny books, but he was not really acknowledged as a serious writer until he wrote Brideshead Revisited, which was not a fully comic book in the way that his earlier work was. This is something that those of us who are comic writers deal with quite a bit. Writers like Sam Lipsyte, for example, another New Yorker. To what extent, and what's weird is, the critical establishment does take me seriously, reviews me, and considers me to be worthy of attention. But at the same time, I realize that once you cross the barrier from purely comic writing into what's considered much more serious writing, you do get a new level of attention from various people. Because humor is very difficult. What's funny to me may not be funny to you, or vice versa. Whereas drama is very clearly understood. We all can identify with it. So, will I always write in the very same comedic vein? I don't think so. I think I'm going to vary the pitch and timbre of what I write. But when I read something funny, that makes my day. And when I see a funny film or watch a funny series, and even The Wire had some very, very funny moments, which I hope to replicate tonight. Remember Bunk at that bar in McNulty? Yeah. So, but even that had, so what's important is that there's a seriousness of purpose, I think, behind whatever you write. And then which way you choose to convey it, whether humorously or not, that depends on what kind of audience that is out there. Some of you have seen it, yeah. The conceit of the trailer is that I never learned how to read. I can't read, and James Franco teaches me. But throughout the film, we play with this dachshund. His name is Felix. He is so adorable. I like long-haired dachshunds because they're part spaniel, and that kind of grounds them a little bit. What's incredible about this breed, and it feels like it's as an immigrant, I can identify with this breed because they're awkward. They're not they're long, and their legs are too small to carry this ginormous body. And in fact, to lift them, you have to lift them, you know, using both hands, because you can't, otherwise you'll break their spine. That kind of fragility reminds me of me as an 8-year-old in Queens, you know, on that plane taxi to a stop at Kennedy Airport. I also was fragile and had short little stubby legs. So this is my dog, and always will be.
Are you neutralized? Are you an American? And if so, do you feel that you have something of the spirit of America in you, or do you feel like an immigrant? You can say, I'm an immigrant.
Right. The question is, have I been neutered like my dachshund? And if so, do I miss the life of having all my parts? No, I'm sorry. The question is, have I been naturalized? Yes, I have been naturalized. I've been naturalized for some time now. Yeah. That always happens when I talk about my immigrant status. MICA is out there, and they want to know. Do I feel like an American? Yeah. You know what's interesting is that my first 2 books, Absurdistan, Russian Debutante's Handbook, they were about Russians in Russia. They were all set abroad, and I kind of destroyed the former Soviet Union in those 2 books, especially in Absurdistan. And it felt a little bit abstract doing that, you know. But in this book, this hurt more to write, because it's America. It's the Walmarts and the Dwayne Reeds that are on fire. And that makes it less abstract. And I do love this country, and I'm very scared for this country. And so in writing this book, I was very... it's a love story, I think, in 2 ways. It's a love story. Lenny loves Eunice. Eunice begins to love Lenny back at some point. But it's also, Lenny loves America, and Lenny loves New York, and he feels these 2 things are slipping out of his grasp. That's very hard to write about, you know, because in a sense you're writing about 2 doomed love affairs. And I think the connection I've had with America has grown recently, because you start to, when you start to worry about the land, you know, you stop taking it for granted and you become more attached to it. When I went to Oberlin, that was the first time I felt like a Russian, because being a Russian, being any kind of immigrant, was so cool at Oberlin, you know. I had this little play, I am ethnic, hear me roar, from Taipei to Bangalore. And, you know, and people loved it. It was such a great school in terms of having a second identity. Everybody wanted some kind of other identity. And after Oberlin, I investigated Russia so much, I kept going back to it. I kept trying to figure out essentially who my parents were. You know, I kept looking at the way people acted. I spent so much time there. And then I spent a lot of time in Italy and other countries, and I began to miss America, and I began to miss having a connection with America. And interestingly enough, I mean, I keep bringing up The Wire, but shows like The Wire, which I would watch on my DVD and whichever hellhole of a country I would end up in, you know, reminded me of what I missed. You know, it's not a flattering portrayal of anything exactly, of an American urban environment, but there was something about it that felt so real and arose my compassion and pity. And those are the things that I wanted to inject in a work like Super Sad True Love Story. And that's, I think, whether the book succeeds or fails, rests primarily with how people perceive on whether I've done a good job of doing that. Any other last questions or thoughts, please?
I'm just curious as to how you got your work out there and, like, you know, from the publisher.
How did I find a publisher? When I finished this book, well, I was close to finishing this book as a senior at Oberlin, but I really thought it was really not a good book. And I was living in Park Slope, Brooklyn, along with Paul. And I remember I just kept throwing out, back then the books were printed out on paper. So I printed it out and I thought, oh, this is such crap. And I put it in, of course, a recyclable garbage bag, and I put it out on 7th Avenue where I lived. And this huge storm came and ripped, it was a very cheap recyclable garbage bag because I was very poor. And I was walking down 7th Avenue, which is the Champs-Élysées of Park Slope, Brooklyn. And there was a rainstorm, and my entire opus was fluttering around. And like an idiot, I'd written Gary Shteyngart on every page. And people would be walking, hey, page 240 looks pretty good there, Shteyngart. So I was very scared about sending the work out, primarily because I felt that this was the first Russian-American novel of my generation. You know, there were great novels by Dominicans like Junot Diaz, Bengalis like Jhumpa Lahiri, and my favorite of the crew was Chang-Rae Lee, a professor, Korean-American professor and writer. who at that point was teaching at Hunter College. And I applied to Hunter College to the MFA, Masters of Fine Arts program. I need to tell you what an MFA is. To the MFA program at Hunter College in writing, just because I wanted to study with Shteyngart, because I thought he was really nailing the immigrant experience on the head. And, you know, and then he wrote back and he said, oh my God, this is so good, we can get this published right now. And he sent it to his editor, and she bought it 2 weeks later. And then it was published a year later, which was very odd. But I still stuck around and studied with him because he was amazing, you know. And he said, going back to what you were saying about, you know, comedy, and he had the first draft of Russian Deb, and he said, it's very funny. He said, it's a comedy of manners, it's very funny. But can you delve a little deeper? What is the immigrant experience to you? And he said this phrase, he said, talk about the blood and guts of the immigrant experience. If you can do that, and I know you're worried about, you know, you're thinking it's the first Russian-American novel, you'll offend so many people. You'll offend your parents, of course, which I did. But, you know, if you can do that, that's a step beyond what you've been doing so far. And that was advice that I hope I took to heart. But it's interesting, I mean, in a different ways, thinking about writing. The MFA programs, I don't know how this is in film or visual arts, they are now, in writing, they are the gatekeepers to, especially in that little ghetto we call literary fiction, they are the gatekeepers to who gets published and who doesn't. You know, schools like Columbia, where I teach, that's where the agents swoop in and pick up the talent, or Iowa, of course, the best example of the lot. And probably something like this maybe happens here as well. But it's interesting, the days of, you know, Hemingway and Dos Passos and Faulkner and Fitzgerald all drinking it up on the southern coast of France, and then drunkenly Mad Men style walking into their publisher's office and demanding a martini in advance. You know, those days are not really there anymore. Everyone, and people and writers have gotten really boring. You know, no one's drunk anymore. You go to a party in New York. I mean, hopefully Paul and I will rectify that tonight. But you know, you go to a bar, you go to Paris, you go to some literary party in New York, and there's all these, you know, middle-aged men, and they're just standing around and just talking about their health insurance. You know? So Cigna has a new paper plate plan. It sounds pretty good. But what's the deductible? Asked over a ginger ale, that is the saddest question I have ever. This is not why I became a writer. You know, this is. I was thinking of Hemingway and all that crap. But no running of the bulls for me. It's like running of the HMOs.
You mentioned that your writing irritated your parents. Was that something that you needed to work through with them, or did they accept it?
Well, each book I write, my father calls and says, you know, is this book going to be good for the Jews? And I always say, this book's not going to be good for anybody. Jews, Koreans, Lithuanians, everyone's going down, you know. Because, you know, I'm not a big nationalist, so, yeah, they're used to it by now, you know. They make up for it by incessantly Googling me all the time. So that when I come to their house, they'll say, oh, the New York Times thinks you're great, but Misha from Murmansk says you're a schmuck. You know? Just printed that out. So, you know, it's a very nice thing for them to do. They keep a kind of equilibrium.
That they know with their parents because they print it out.
Exactly. Yeah, no, they don't have an iTelephone. Yeah.
They keep it in a binder.
They have all these binders, you know, people who hate you in Murmansk, you know. No, I love them. They're wonderful in that sense, that they're always keeping my feet on the ground.
You said that Super Tattoo Love Story is a love story, and it's called, you know, Love Story. But I think all three of your books not only talk about love, but talk about, like, love for a place, love of, like, the immigrant child to the parents who've had a vastly different experience, and also love for something that's going down. So, in what way is Super Tattoo Love Story set apart? You know what I mean? In what way is Super Tattoo Love Story more love story than other two books?